I'm going to talk about bias and causality and how it interacts with our observations. And so you could imagine you have a very large picture, but you were only able to see half the picture. So would you prefer a particular half of the picture, a random scatter? And this kind of addresses bias. But let's say there was some underlying motivation behind the picture too. That would be kind of like causality. So you're a researcher and you want to understand the average height of all MSJC students, and that's kind of like your overall population. While you can go out and use a lot of time and resources, you might be able to collect observations of all MSJC students. But you figured, why not we could do a sample and see if we could still get a relatively accurate answer. And so your friend proposes to you, how about we go and collect only basketball students? And right away you'll know that the average height of basketball students is generally higher than the average, maybe the average student at MSJC. And you're mostly right. That would create a biased sample, a sample that is not a representation of the population. So now you have another friend. It's like the cafeteria is a very popular place. Why don't we instead go and collect everybody from the cafeteria? You're going to get a very large sample. I think it might be worth something. But what if athletic people visit the cafeteria more often? It might not be something you realize, but that might also bias your sample, not get a representation of the entire population. And there's so many things that could be out there. If you prefer to collect the sample on a Tuesday, what if there is a different proportion of athletic classes on a Tuesday, and then again it builds onto it? Your sample might not be a representation of the entire population. And so that kind of relates to bias. But how we are every day, there is so much information out there, and it's impossible for our brains to understand it. We just don't know everything in the entire universe. And so we're continuously collecting a sample of our observations. But even if we were unbiased individuals, we somehow knew when we weren't going to be biased, we still need to make the proper inferences, and this is kind of where causality plays a role. So starting out, there's many different types of biases in statistics. And three of them, I'll give some examples. There's kind of like pre-screening bias. There's also survivorship bias. And one that I'm going to be focusing the most on is self-selecting bias. And so an example of pre-screening bias. A city official, he wants to collect, this big thing about our water being polluted. And so they want to assess the water quality, and they go and check the pipes. The city official doesn't have a very big budget to do this, and he doesn't really want to, or she. And so what they do instead is they go into a newer part of the city and they say, well, it's much easier to do this part of the city. We could assess the water quality, and then we'll be good. But as you're thinking, well, if you only assess the newer part of the city, it could be that the newer part of the city just has better water quality. It's not a fair representative sample of the entire city. And so that's something like pre-screening bias. Survivorship bias is slightly different. Let's say you're doing biological study, or let's say a medical study, and you want to understand if this cancer treatment is working on mice. And so what you do is you report that out of the 20 mice that had survived, 15 of them were cured of cancer. They're in remission. But what was not reported was that there were 100 mice in the entire participation. What happened was 80 of them had died, and they only reported the 20 that had survived. And so you would think, well, maybe the 80 had died from the cancer that they weren't cured. And that would be important. That would reduce the efficiency of the drug. And so that would be something called like survivorship bias. But one thing that I really want to elaborate on tonight, because it affects all of us, is self-selecting bias. And let me just give a really good example, and then I'll go into why we're affected by it. So self-selecting bias is, we want to understand the proportion of people that can make a three-point shot in basketball. Well, I can't do it, unfortunately. So if someone had asked me if you want to try and make this three-point shot, I'd be like, no way. But other things, so that's the thing, it's unethical to force someone to actually go out and try it. And so the people who are more likely able to do it are the people who are more likely able to try it. And so when you get these results, 75% of the people that were able to make it, well, it's self-selected that you would think this is biased more towards up. And so we are very self-selecting people. The reason why you're here today, the reason why you have the friends that you do, the reason why you do the activities that you do are all self-selected. And so you're kind of doing this self-selecting bias of the observations you observe. So there was a recent political study article, and it was by Keaton, Van Boven, and Jude. And the article was called Partisan Underestimation of Polarizing Influences of Group Discussion. And this was in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, volume 65. And it's a confusing title. I read that and I was like, I know what they're trying to say, but I'm not familiar with these words. And what it basically says that when you're in group-minded individuals, like maybe in political atmosphere, you tend to underestimate your biases. You're just simply not aware of them. And so that kind of has a greater implication that you might not be aware of any other biases that you have. You're self-selecting these people you choose to hang out with. And so one example that recently happened, I'm a member of a lot of social media pages. That's where I generally do interactions at. But there was one particular, after the World Logistics Center passed in Reno Valley, it was very controversial. And so what happened with this, what's also called the WLC, was that members of a specific page are very vocal against the WLC. And so what was happening was that she was like, all the people on this page, we don't want the WLC, we're against it. So why does the city council believe that we want the WLC? And so we have this bias that she's using the members of the page to kind of represent the city as a whole. And so I wasn't going to say whether or not I was against it or for it. I was just going to point out that there's actually very large other Facebook pages for Moreno Valley that were for the WLC, just to kind of say, those people exist. And so she kind of responded that, well, they're actually fake people, that these profiles are not real, these were paid by big money, and she kept going on. And it kind of agitated me, because I went to 3 of these city council meetings that were deciding this, and I've met hundreds of people and their testimonies. And it happens at these meetings that most of the people were for the WLC, and that could have been a bias sample too. But I just wanted to let her know that, it's not necessarily what you think, that your observations, what you're observing right now, might not be a reflection of the entire population. It just doesn't work. And then I added this phrase that you might be delusional if you had thought that. And I ended up getting banned from that page, so it happened. Yeah. So even if we were unbiased individuals, like if she had known that what more pages, you still have to make accurate inferences. That's what we want to do. We want to understand our reality. And so there's also causality that plays a very important role. And if you guys have heard before, correlation does not imply causation. And before I get into that, let's get into what is correlation if you haven't heard or haven't seen this. And there's 2 examples that I'm going to do. Something that's positive correlated, something that's negative correlated. And so something that's positive correlated is like when I go out to karaoke nights. The amount of beers that I drink means that there's probably more songs that I'm going to do. And it's usually in that order too, so I can't do it in the opposite order. And another thing of negative correlation. Negative doesn't necessarily imply bad, it's just an inverse relationship. For an example, the more Netflix that I watch, the less work that I'm doing. And so, as one goes up, one goes down. And when I binge watch Breaking Bad, I probably moved twice in that 12, 14 days or something like that. Yeah. And so, let's get an example. The 3 C's that will help us with that. You have causation, you have correlation, and then you have coincidence. And so something that's causation, you could have 2 things. As A changes, B is directly changing. They have a direct connection with each other. Correlation, on the other hand, is as A changes, there's other things that are going around. And so B is also changing, but there's this indirect connection. It might not necessarily be connected to each other, but they're associated. The last thing is coincidence. There's a lot of things you might find that A is changing and B looks like it's also changing, but it's just coincidence. And so a motivating example is like homelessness and crime rate. You could actually go out to a lot of city pages and look at the amount of homeless people that's estimated, the amount of crime rate. And what you'll see is that the more homeless people there are, a lot of times the higher the crime rate. And so when you look at this, you might be tempted to say that homeless people are causing crime. And well, I do live in Riverside, and I don't want to talk down on it, but a homeless guy tried breaking into my place the first night I was there. So anyways, but what could happen is there's other variables out there. Like for an example, a specific drug. And this specific drug is causing the homeless population to go up, and this specific drug is also causing crime rate to go up. And so from an essence, this third confounding variable is like there's correlation between the two, but it's not, may not exactly be causation. And so if a city official were to remove all the homeless people, they're not actually removing the source of the problem. That drug is still causing a crime rate, and you want to fix it at the source of the problem. So that's why it's very important to understand causality, so you understand the root of the sources. You understand what's actually happening and not just association. And so, what is the specific definition of causality in statistics? You could imagine you have two parallel worlds, and these worlds are identical in every single way possible. And just in this hypothetical scenario, you're able to manipulate things in one of the worlds. The causal factor would be kind of the resultant of that manipulation, and when you compare the two worlds together. They're identical in every single way but that change, and that's called the causal factor. But we can't do that, and a lot of times sciences can't do that too. We're not advanced at yet. So the next best thing is like a controlled experimental design. And a lot of sciences are able to do this, like biological sciences. They have a bunch of important effects that they're able to control, and so you fix as much as possible, and you make these altered changes. But of course you won't get the same results every time, so you do a number of them, a large number of samples, and then you kind of see what is the causal effect. Well, unfortunately, we live in an area where we're just like an observational study. What that means is we have no control. There is so much going on around us that we absolutely cannot control anything. And so when we see things that look associated with each other, it's a very big assumption to say that they're causal. And so, for an example, I'm the president of the National Honor Society for UCR. So we actually are the 27th chapter of statistics for the Honor Society. And the Department of Statistics is very small. If you were to go to biology, psychology, almost any other department, you would have a much bigger size at UCR. And so we have trouble getting a lot of members in the Honor Society. Not that we have a lot of students, but a lot of people don't like to participate too. And so the student org advisor says, why don't you tell them when they join an honor society, not necessarily statistics, that they're more likely able to find a job? And so while that might be true, when you join an honor society, there might be some effect of the honor society itself that will help you find a job. But unfortunately, too, people who are likely able to succeed are also going to join the honor society. Regardless if they joined the honor society, they were likely to find a job in the first place. And so these people are likely to join the honor society. These people are also finding jobs. So if there was an effect of the honor society that were causing jobs, they're mixed together, and we were unable to separate them. And that's kind of like the curse of observational studies. And so what it comes down to with bias and causation, like what's the take-home point? Well, unfortunately, there's so much complicated stuff going on into our world that what we really need to do is be an expert level in the subject matter that you're doing. And what I see on social media a lot of times is that people feel they're experts based off a Facebook post. You've seen them too. They're impossible to argue with them. But there's also, what is an expert? Do I read a few science articles? And that does help. Or how about I watched an entire season of Dr. Oz? Can I be a medical professional? I'll leave that up to you. But what the truth is that there's many professors who spend decades in their research, and they're still likely able to make mistakes, although it's not as likely as most other people. So we got to be very careful of what we're trying to say, and be very skeptic of whether or not what we believe is true, or it could be biased, or are we understanding something wrong. And so one thing that I like to do, I actually like to make mistakes, because when I make mistakes, I know I put myself into a situation I'm not really used to. And so to conclude, there's a quote by Albert Einstein, and it's, anyone who has never made a mistake has never tried anything new. Thank you.